comfortable with a pretty violent film, it's very much worth seeing. There's a second one out now that I haven't seen. I think it got pretty bad reviews, but you could maybe look into the second one too. But Gladiator, it's a fictional movie, but it's historical fiction. So it's a fictional story set in a historical time period. It's actually set in the 2nd century, in the time that we're studying in this class. But even though it's fiction, it captures this part of history that we're talking about right now really well. There was a deep fascination in ancient Greco-Roman culture with gladiator contests and games like that. This was a major form of entertainment. So Rome and other cities in the Roman Empire, they would often take prisoners of war and put them in an arena, and before a packed audience, they would fight each other to the death. Or if they weren't fighting each other, they might set wild animals on them in the arena, like lions and tigers, and they would fight them to the death. And then in addition to prisoners of war, there may be other slaves, or there may be convicted criminals who would be forced to fight. And then on top of that, some people actually saw an opportunity for a career in being a gladiator, and they would volunteer to fight in the arena. And as they won their, matches, they would become quite popular and become something of a celebrity, a lot like the way athletes in our culture today are celebrities. And if they stayed alive long enough, they could make quite a bit of money. And then they could back out, I'm assuming at the right time, but they would make quite a bit of money, and they could use that to provide for themselves, provide for their families. But people loved going to these games. And the games would sometimes, they would have other forms of entertainment mixed in, more harmless ones. So there might be like chariot races and things like that. But they loved going to these games, watching the violence, cheering for their favorite gladiator, placing bets, and doing all this with their friends and family. So I hope that sounds sick to us, because it should. And it certainly sounded that way to the Christians of the 2nd century. And so they refused to attend or take part in these games. A couple of examples on the screen. This is from a 2nd century writer called Athenagoras, or Athenagoras, different ways to pronounce these guys. But this is what he says. Who does not reckon among the things of greatest interest the contests of gladiators and wild beasts, especially those which are given by you? But we, deeming that to see a man put to death is much the same as killing him, have abjured such spectacles. Notice that way he talks about this. We consider that going to these games and watching someone put to death for fun is on par with putting them to death ourselves, and we want nothing to do with that. This is from Tertullian, who lived in the late 2nd and then into the 3rd century. This is what he has to say. He has a treatise all about Christians and entertainment called On the Shows, and this is what he says in chapter 19. It's in the midst of a larger conversation. But he says, at any rate, gladiators not chargeable with crime are offered in sale for the games, that they may become the victims of the public pleasure. Even in the case of those who are judicially condemned to the amphitheater, what a monstrous thing it is that in undergoing their punishment, they, from some less serious delinquency, advance to the criminality of manslayers. So notice what he's saying here. He says, you have these gladiators, and even if they haven't done anything wrong during the games, then even the criminals. We might think, okay, well, that's justifiable. Maybe some in their culture would say that. He says, no. They aren't convicted murderers. Maybe they're convicted of something else. Then you throw them in the arena, and they become murderers in the arena. And this is awful. So this is the position of the early church. Now, this position makes perfect sense in light of the foundations that we were looking at last time. Because think about what some of those foundations were. If God truly loves all of humanity, he loves all people, well, how could Christians rejoice in seeing someone put to death for sport? How could Christians rejoice in entertainment like that if God loves even the people who are in that arena. I'm really thankful, like I'm sure we all are here, I'm really thankful that these types of gladiator contests are not part of our culture today, but blood sport, in some ways, certainly still is. So think with me, for example, about maybe some of the extreme martial arts and forms of boxing in our culture, like extreme MMA or something like that, I think it's called. As I say this, I'm not trying to say that I think like all forms of boxing are inherently sinful. Maybe you think they are, and maybe they are, but I'm not trying to say that right now. But I think at least with the more extreme versions of that, we can see that same thirst for violence at work. And fortunately, it doesn't involve killing someone, at least not intentionally, although that's a risk. But it definitely involves pummeling them while people are watching for entertainment. And then, of course, we could think about movies and shows that have tons of gratuitous violence. I think a lot of us would agree, and there's room for disagreement on this. We don't have to all see this type of thing exactly the same way, but I think most of us in general would say it's one thing for violence to be part of a story about good versus evil, or a story that's maybe it's depicting an historical time period, and maybe it was while a war was going on, and so there's violence. I mentioned the movie Gladiator, it's quite violent. But it's another thing for a movie or show to just show violence as much as possible because they know that the audience just loves taking it in. That's another way of gratifying that same thirst for violence. So even though the circumstances are different, this is something that Christians still need to think about as being part of our culture. Any questions or comments on that? Go ahead, Barbara.
There is a subculture that is heavily involved in man-slaying type activities, like the people that just punch old people in the side of the head and knock them out. There's a knockout club, and they love to put it on TikTok, and they show all these things, and there's knivings and stabbings and attacking innocent people on the streets. It's happening.
That's a good point.
It's popular.
Yeah.
And it gets a lot of ratings, on the social media.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so that is an expression of the same thing. Yeah, thank you for that.
It's just not sanctioned or approved.
Yeah, you won't find people.
MMA fighters or.
Yeah, people won't be turning on the TV on Sunday afternoon to watch gladiators. Yeah, but anything else? Okay, so what we've looked at so far is something that the early church rejected. Now we're going to turn to consider some of the things that they committed themselves to. They didn't just reject things, they also committed themselves to other things. Something that the second century church was very much committed to was living as model citizens, model residents of the Roman Empire. And so this certainly has firm roots in the New Testament. So this is 1 Peter. He says, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people." So, see here, we need to submit to the government so that when people want to malign us as being troublemakers and lawbreakers, they have really no evidence to produce. And we could think also Paul in Romans 13 has a very similar teaching to what we just read here. Here's another passage from Paul, this time from 1 Timothy. He says, "First of all, then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for all people, for kings, and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way." So here's some New Testament teachings on living as model citizens, praying for our rulers, respecting the laws of the land. With these passages in mind, listen to the words now of some second century writers. This is from the book of 1 Clement that we've quoted from a couple times already in here. This is near the end of this pretty lengthy letter, and it actually closes with a prayer to God, a lengthy prayer. So the author is speaking to God, and the readers are meant to be hearing or maybe joining in this prayer as he's saying it. But this is what he says in the midst of his prayer. Give harmony and peace both to us and to all those who dwell on the earth, just as you have given to our forefathers when they called upon you reverently in faith and truth, being obedient to your all-powerful and glorious name, both to our rulers and governors upon the earth. You, Master, talking to God, you have given the power of the kingdom to them through your magnificent and indescribable power, so that we may know the glory and honor given to them by you and be subject to them, in no way opposing your will. To whom, Lord, give health, peace, harmony, and good disposition, so that they may administer the government given by you to them without stumbling. For you, heavenly Master, King of the ages, have given to the sons of men glory and honor and power over the things which belong upon the earth. You, Lord, direct their plan according to what is good and pleasing in your presence, so that, piously administering with peace and gentleness the authority given by you to them, they may experience your mercy. I know that's rather lengthy and rather flowery. It's also quite beautiful to read. But I hope you can hear there some of the similarities to Paul in 1 Timothy 2. Praying for peace, praying for the rulers to govern in such a way that we can live in peace. So I want us to think for a moment about how this again connects to the foundations that we talked about last week for how Christians live. So they believe there is only one God. All the other gods are false. We talked last time about how Greeks and Romans believed that all those gods maintained the social order, beginning with the emperor and going all the way down to the bottom of the social ladder. So you needed to honor the gods to keep the social order from dissolving into chaos. But when the Christians say, no, those gods are false, that doesn't mean just revolting against the entire system. It doesn't mean just rebelling against that, even though those false gods were believed to uphold that system. It instead meant understanding that actually the system is overseen by the one true God. So that means service to God means respecting the governing authorities, not ignoring them and not rebelling against them. Here's another passage from the Epistle to Diognetus. This is an apologetic work. He's trying to explain the faith to non-believers. This is what he says. For Christians, neither by country or language or customs are distinguished from the rest of humanity. Okay, so these are not the things that set Christians apart. We're just like everybody else in that regard. But while living in both Greek and barbarian, which means just non-Greek, Greek and barbarian cities, as each have obtained by lot, and while following the local customs, both in clothing and in diet and in the rest of life, they demonstrate the wonderful and most certainly strange character of their own citizenship. They spend time upon the earth, but have their citizenship in heaven. That sounds a lot like the Apostle Paul. They obey the appointed laws, and in their own lives, they surpass the law. So notice what the author says here, especially at the very last sentence. Christians are not just law-abiding citizens. They actually live even better than what the law requires. So they don't just keep the bare minimum, right? They don't just go right up to the line of what Roman law says is legal and just make sure not to cross it. They go above and beyond what the law says to do. And this is something that other apologists besides this stress as well at this time. They frequently point out, the Roman Empire is sometimes killing Christians, and they'll point out, this is so disadvantageous for the empire. The Roman Empire is better off having Christians among its numbers because Christians make things so easy for the governing authorities. They're not troublemakers. Like, you want more of us in your society is the point that they keep making. So I want us to take a moment to just appreciate how it is, and we see this kind of reflected here in this passage, how it is that Christians were such model citizens. Is it because they were so focused on following Roman law? Not really. They focused on following the law of Christ, which was a higher standard than Roman law. And so as long as that was their focus, well, they were always going to be going above and beyond what Roman law required. They were always going to be model citizens. And I think there's great implications there for how we live. If we focus with complete dedication on following the law of Christ, others will see that and will go above and beyond the worldly expectations for how we're called to live. Any questions or comments on these passages before we keep going? Go ahead, Sue.
I like where it says they spend time upon the earth, but have their citizenship in heaven.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of like us. We're living here on earth, but we
That's right.
want our citizenship. We want to end up in heaven.
That's right. Like the song we often sing, this world is not our home. We're here, but it's not where we belong.
I thought it was interesting about they follow local customs and clothing and diet and the rest of their lives, kind of
Yeah.
like assimilating into your environment.
Yeah.
You know, like we have that, a lot of immigration over here and refugees and stuff. And,
Yeah.
it's very important to assimilate into the country's cultures and
Yeah.
stuff to get along.
Yeah.
I find it very interesting.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. And this was something unique about Christianity that we can take for granted now. But ancient religion was very tied to ancient cultures. Of course, there's a lot of variety, just like today in ancient cultures. Even Judaism, if you wanted to believe in the one true God, you were going to pretty well fall in line with a different culture's way of living than a Greek or Roman one. So each religion was very culturally bound. Christianity transcends all those and says, no, we don't follow one particular culture's way of doing things. We follow whatever culture's way of doing things that we're a part of, but yet there's something very different about us because we don't belong to any of those cultures. Our citizenship is in heaven. All right. Well, let's keep going. Something else that the second century church was devoted to was preserving and protecting new life. I think we can say this without any qualification necessary. If the second century church could speak to debates in our society about when human life begins and abortion and things, they would be unquestionably pro-life. This was a feature of second century Christianity. Now, the way that this took shape in ancient times was different than ours because it was a different time. So, in ancient times, abortions did happen, but it was without modern medical technology. It was a much more difficult and a much less safe procedure. So while they happened, it was more common if there was an unwanted child to carry the child, for a woman to carry the child to term, give birth, and then abandon the child to die as an infant. That was the more common practice than an abortion. So that practice is the practice of exposure. That's the term for it. That's where infants are simply exposed to the elements and left to die, often by just finding a trash heap and leaving them there. And so, as I described that, this is also something like the gladiator contest that should make us sick to think about. It's a terrible, evil thing to do. Now, ancient Greeks and Romans, and it was pretty common practice. They might expose their infants for different reasons. Like any widespread practice, there might be different reasons for doing it. So it could be that a family simply feels that they cannot afford another mouth to feed. And this, like we talked about a few weeks ago, this is a world where almost everyone is quite poor. And then there's a few really wealthy people that are separate, but almost everyone is quite poor. And so they may feel like exposing their infant is necessary in order to continue providing for the children they already have. So as I say that of course is not a justification for a practice like this, but that could very easily be the reasoning. Another big reason in ancient culture is the desire especially for male offspring. In ancient times, males are the ones with higher social status. They're the ones that can preserve the family line. They're the ones that can carry on the family's trade, their line of work, inherit property. So there's a lot of pressure to have male children making it more likely to expose female infants. So this is, of course, terribly tragic. Well, early Christians refused to take part in this. They refused to expose their infants. And not only would they not expose their own children, they would go a step further, and they would go and find children who had been exposed and save them, take them in, and raise them to be Christians. And again, on top of exposure, also abortions happened in ancient times, and the early church was opposed to that too, and very explicitly condemned both of those things. So here's a couple of passages. Again, back to the Epistle of Diognetus. He's describing Christians, and he says, they marry like everyone, they bear children, but they do not expose their offspring. This is from the Didache, which is kind of like a manual for how to be a Christian and how to live, how to do church life. And the opening chapters are a lot of negative commandments forbidding different things. And this is what they say. Do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not sodomize, homosexuality, do not commit sexual immorality, do not steal, do not practice magic, do not use potions. And then here's our main one for right now. Do not murder a child by abortion, do not kill the just born one. So I think there you've got both abortion and exposure as separate prohibitions there in the Didache. And then here's a lengthier one from another guy we've read a lot from, Justin Martyr, another apologetic work. This is what he has to say along these lines. Lest we molest anyone, just in the sense of doing harm to them, lest we molest anyone or commit sin ourselves, we have been taught that it is wicked to expose even newly born children. First, because we see that almost all those who are exposed, not only girls but boys, are raised in prostitution. As your forefathers are said to have raised herds of oxen or goats or sheep or grazing horses, you now raise children only for this same disgraceful purpose. For in every country there is a throng of females, hermaphrodites, and degenerates ready for this evil practice. And you, who should eradicate them from your land, instead accept wages, tribute, and taxes from them. Anyone who consorts with them, besides being guilty of a godly, impious, and shameful action, may by some chance be guilty of intercourse with his own child, or relative, or brother. Okay, so this passage here reflects another sad reality of exposure. Of course, the child may die, which is terrible, but also Christians were not the only ones going around to trash heaps and picking up infants. Also, others would do that, and they get a free slave out of it. Or they may sell that child into prostitution and start making money from that child. So Christians aren't the only ones going around taking in exposed infants, but others are doing this for terrible and evil purposes, while Christians are doing it to save those children's lives and raise them in the church. And notice especially Justin Martyr's argument at the end. He said, no, this is a terrible practice, and yet you all will take taxes from these people who are raised in prostitution. But then he goes further, and he says, technically, you don't know if your child is exposed and then taken up, and then you sleep with a prostitute. That could be your child. Of course, that's probably extraordinarily unlikely, but you can't rule out the possibility, right? And so this is the way he's arguing to show how terrible the practice is. So the early church we see here recognized that new life was always to be cherished. And again, let's connect this back to the foundations that we looked at last week. They understood, like with the gladiators, God loves all humanity. And so all human life, from an unborn child, even one that the family, for tragic reasons, not justifiable reasons, has decided they don't want, or if it's a prisoner of war or a criminal being thrown into the arena, all human life has value. And this is simply not the way that ancient people understood God. They did not believe the gods. They did not believe that the gods loved all of humanity. And so it's not the way that they treated their fellow humans. So I hope we can see here how the way a person views God has direct consequences for how we treat one another. And because the Christians viewed God differently, They viewed other people very differently. Any questions? Joe?
If a child wasn't perfect, like whether it's Down syndrome or any other kind of deformity, still today, I mean, they're not accepted.
Yeah.
It's like a curse.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, those are reasons why some might pursue an abortion today. And it's not hard to imagine if there's a very clear deformity when a child is born back then, that would be a very common reason to expose the infant. All right, so I hope we're seeing how radically different Christians lived in some of these areas in light of how they understood the gospel and how they understood God. We're doing pretty good on time. Actually, we're doing great on time. So let's keep on going. The early church also deeply valued caring for the poor, caring for those in need. And this, of course, has good roots in the first century church. There's a lot of passages we could pull from, but this is the one I chose. Paul in Galatians 6, he says, "So then, as we have opportunity, let us do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith." So Paul says, do good to all people, but notice he says, look out especially for your brothers and sisters, especially for the household of faith. So he's saying here to take care of the needs of our brothers and sisters first, to prioritize that, and then look to meet the needs of others. This makes good sense, I think, all the time, but especially in ancient times where, again, most people are poor. So you're going to have a lot of Christians in the early church with a lot of needs. So Paul is saying, tend to them. They are your new family. And then also look out for the needs of others as well. Well, this emphasis on caring for the poor also continued in the 2nd century. So to go back to another writing by Tertullian, he is here talking about the collection that the church took up, like we take up a collection every Sunday. He refers to them as gifts, because they're money just given. This is what he says. These gifts are, as it were, piety's deposit fund. For they are not taken thence and spent on feasts and drinking bouts and eating houses. All right, so we're not using this money to party, but to support and bury poor people, to supply the wants of boys and girls destitute of means and parents, and of old persons confined now to the house, such too as have suffered shipwreck. And if there happen to be any in the mines, or banished to the islands, or shut up in the prisons, for nothing but their fidelity to the cause of God's church. So if they're sentenced to those fates because they're Christians, they become the nurslings of their confession. In other words, the church takes care of them because of the faith that they confess. But it is mainly the deeds of a love so noble that lead many to put a brand upon us. And the brand is, see, they say, how they loved one another. That's pulling from the Gospel of John when the crowd says, see how Jesus loved Lazarus. He's saying, people will look at us in the way we treat one another, and they say, see how the Christians love one another. So he's saying that when they take up that collection, they use that money. Major ways they use it is to feed the poor among them. Also notice to bury poor people. Proper burial costs money in ancient times, like today, and a lot of people didn't have money. And so there were actually whole non-Christian clubs that would meet, and the sole purpose is to contribute money to bury each other when they pass. Well, Christians, instead of joining a pagan association like that, they said, hey, we've already got a group. We'll use some of our funds so when a brother or sister dies, we'll pay for their burial. And then all these other things as well that are mentioned. Those who were shut in and confined to their homes, those who've been victims of shipwreck, I'm guessing that means they've got permanent injuries, those who've been put into forced labor and exiled. So they're definitely using their funds to fulfill Galatians 6:10, right? To care for one another in need. This is another writing from a man named Dionysius who lived in the 2nd century. A church historian named Eusebius, a couple centuries later, is quoting Dionysius. So we're reading one Christian quoting another. But this is what Dionysius says. He says, for from the beginning it has been your practice, he's talking about the Christians in Rome, it has been your practice to do good in various ways to all the brethren, and to send contributions to many churches in every city, thus relieving the poverty of the needy and ministering to the Christians in the mines by the contributions which you have made from the beginning, preserving as true Romans the ancestral custom of the Romans. So here, Dionysius is actually talking about the church going a step further than our Tertullian quote that we just read. Tertullian was talking about using the funds to care for members in the church. Dionysius is saying, you go beyond that, you gather funds and then you'll send them to other churches where there are other Christians in need as well, and those funds will bless them. So we see the second century church continuing to care for those in need. This was something they were very focused on. Any questions or comments on what we've read? All right, well, we're very nearly done. One more point, and this one will be shorter than the others. Last one we'll make for tonight is the early church was committed to marital faithfulness from both parties in marriage. Right? So there's a certain level, there's a standard, a high standard for sexual morality. Now, I think pretty much, and I know there are exceptions to this, and it's growing, which is tragic, but pretty much, I think it's still often true. Anyone who values marriage today, whether they're a Christian or non-Christian, values both parties being faithful to that marriage. Now, tragically, there's subculture through dating apps where, like, married couples can get on there and look for other options, and it's awful. But there's still a large trend, Christians and non-Christians. If you're married, there's a great emphasis on, all right, both parties need to be faithful to that marriage. That was not the case in ancient times. It was often widely acceptable for married men to frequently commit adultery, but it was much more shameful for a woman to do that. So there were two different standards, very common in ancient culture. Not so in the early church. Faithful Christians in the early church were faithful to their spouses, and that was true of the husband and the wife. They were both held to the same standard. So there's Paul just in one, there's tons of passages we could look at, but it says, flee from sexual immorality. Well, here's a couple of other passages showing this. Back to Diognetus, still describing Christians, says, they marry like everyone, they bear children, but like we read earlier, they do not expose their offspring. Then in the next verse, they set a common table, but not a common bed. And then Tertullian, again, he says, describing how Christians have all things in common, like the early Jerusalem church. Says, one in mind and soul, we do not hesitate to share our earthly goods with one another. All things are common among us, but our wives. Again, that should be a given, we would probably think, but not in ancient culture. We're willing to share anything but our spouses. That relationship is kept sacred. And so one more time, to return to the foundations that we looked at last week, one of those foundations is God cares about how we live. That's not the way the Greek and Roman gods thought, but Christian God cares about the choices you make, including choices like this. Okay, so we have just kind of surveyed a range of ways that the early Christians lived out the foundations of their faith, what this stuff looked like day to day on the ground for the second century church. So the ones that we talked about, they rejected hurting and killing other people for sport, for entertainment. They cherished life, including unborn life and newly born life. They provided for the poor, especially those among their numbers, but they provided for the poor, and they were faithful in their marriages. And all of these things made them stand out to their neighbors. And so through choices like this that very clearly go against the grain of their culture, made them living testimonies to the truth and to the life-changing power of the gospel. And so I hope as we've looked at these things together, I hope that we can see some ways that we can follow their example. And I hope we can see the power of a transformed life when we're living in a culture that does not celebrate that kind of life. The power of a transformed life and how that can lead to the spread of the gospel and how it certainly leads us to shine as lights in a dark world, like the New Testament says. Any final questions, thoughts, reflections, anything you'd like to add before we dismiss? Well, thanks for being here. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it was encouraging to you, and hope to see you on Sunday and next Wednesday. So we're done. Thank you.
Stay safe out there.